The iron chains weighed 40 pounds. They had been forged specifically for her, commissioned by the Senate itself, crafted by Rome's finest blacksmiths to fit the wrists and ankles of a woman who had once commanded armies, ruled kingdoms, and defied the greatest empire the world had ever known. Now, as the August sun blazed mercilessly over the Via Sacra, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra shuffled forward in golden shackles, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the white marble stones that led toward the Forum Romanum. Behind her, the jeering crowd numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They had waited days for this moment, the triumph of Emperor Aurelian, the final humiliation of the desert queen who had dared to carve an empire from Rome's eastern provinces. But what they were about to witness wasn't just a military parade. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a ceremony of degradation so meticulously designed that its echoes would ripple through history for 2 millennia. And Zenobia was not the first queen to endure this particular Roman tradition. She would not be the last. Before we descend further into this dark chapter of history, if you're drawn to the shadows where power and cruelty intersect, where the truth is more disturbing than fiction, follow this channel. Because the stories Rome tried to bury are the ones that need to be told. To understand what happened to captured queens in Roman hands, you must first understand the triumph, the triumphus, Rome's most sacred and savage ritual of victory. This wasn't merely a parade. It was theater, propaganda, and public torture combined into a single day-long spectacle designed to reinforce a singular message. Resistance to Rome is futile, and defiance will cost you everything. The preparation began months before the actual procession. In the dank cells beneath the Tullianum prison, Rome's oldest and most notorious dungeon, captured royalty would be kept alive, fed just enough to survive. Their wounds tended by military physicians not out of mercy, but necessity. They needed to be conscious and presentable for the performance to come. The prison itself was a hellish pit carved into solid rock beneath the Capitoline Hill, accessed only by a hole in the ceiling through which prisoners were lowered by rope. Plutarch wrote that the stench of death was so overpowering that even the guards refused to descend without cloth wrapped around their faces. Here, queens who had worn purple and gold, who had spoken with the authority of gods, were stripped of their regalia and left in darkness. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical. They were to be broken, not killed, but transformed into living monuments to Roman supremacy. Zenobia had been captured in 272 CE after her audacious attempt to break the eastern provinces away from Roman control. For 5 years, she had ruled an empire stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, minting coins with her own image, declaring her son Augustus, and claiming descent from Cleopatra herself. She was brilliant, multilingual, and according to contemporary accounts, she rode alongside her soldiers, endured the same hardships, and commanded their absolute loyalty. But Rome does not forgive ambition in those it considers subjects, especially not in a woman. The day of Aurelian's triumph, September 274 CE, dawned clear and brutal. By the 3rd hour, the temperature in Rome had already climbed to a scorching 95 degrees. The marble streets radiated heat like the surface of a kiln. The procession began at the Campus Martius and wound its way through the heart of the city in a carefully choreographed sequence designed to build anticipation and dread. First came the spoils of war, cartloads of gold, silver, gems, exotic animals, and plundered artworks. Then the placards, each one detailing Zenobia's crimes against Rome, her territories seized, her armies defeated. The crowd read them aloud, their collective voice building like thunder. Then came the prisoners. Common soldiers shuffled in simple chains, but the queen required special treatment. The golden chains that bound Zenobia weren't just decorative irony. They were so heavy that 2 attendants walked beside her to support the weight, preventing her from collapsing. But they were instructed never to bear the full weight. She had to carry enough to ensure constant pain, constant reminder. One contemporary source, the Historia Augusta, claims the chains weighed as much as the queen herself, though this was likely exaggeration. The reality was sufficiently horrific, but the chains were merely the beginning. Zenobia had been dressed, or rather, costumed, in her own captured regalia. The crown she had worn as Queen of the East now sat mockingly upon her head, too large, tilted at an absurd angle. Her purple robes, symbols of imperial authority, had been altered, cut, torn strategically to expose skin, to suggest vulnerability where there had once been power. Roman soldiers had painted her face with cosmetics in a grotesque parody of royal presentation, the kohl around her eyes running in the heat, the rouge on her cheeks smeared by sweat and tears. She was, simultaneously, everything she had been and a mockery of it. The crowd loved it. The Via Sacra, the sacred way, twisted through the heart of Rome's ceremonial center. Every step was agony. The marble, polished smooth by centuries of processions, was now slick with her blood. Later accounts mention that some in the crowd threw flowers, but whether in admiration or further mockery remains debated. Most threw worse. But Zenobia was not the first queen to suffer this fate, and understanding the pattern reveals something darker about Roman military culture: the systematic sexualization and degradation of powerful women as a weapon of imperial control. 70 years earlier, in 201 CE, Queen Dynamis of the Bosporan Kingdom had been paraded through Rome after her capture by Septimius Severus. The accounts describe her treatment in coded language, but the implications are clear. She was displayed in chains, yes, but also adorned as for a wedding night. Roman euphemism for sexual humiliation. The message was explicit. A woman who wielded political power was ultimately just a body to be conquered, displayed, possessed. Go back further. In 46 BCE, Julius Caesar's triumph over Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV, shocked even Rome's jaded aristocracy. Arsinoe, who had briefly ruled Egypt as co-regent and raised armies against Caesar, was marched through the streets in golden chains. She was 18 years old. Plutarch records that the Roman people, seeing her youth and beauty degraded, began to feel pity, a dangerous emotion that threatened to undermine the propaganda value of the spectacle. Caesar had her released and exiled, rather than executed, but only because the crowd's sympathy risked painting him as a tyrant rather than a liberator. The pattern repeats throughout Roman military history. Queen Boudica of the Iceni was never captured. She poisoned herself rather than face what she knew awaited her in Roman hands, but her daughters suffered fates described only obliquely in historical texts. Tacitus, never one to shy from gruesome detail, uses the phrase "subjected to outrages" and says no more. That silence speaks volumes. What drives an empire to not simply defeat its enemies, but to choreograph their degradation as public entertainment? The answer lies in understanding Rome's relationship with power, gender, and the performance of domination. Roman military culture was built on a foundation of virtus, masculine virtue, courage, strength. The Latin word itself derives from vir, meaning man. To be conquered by Rome was to be feminized, to be reduced from active subject to passive object. When the conquered was already a woman, and worse, a woman who had wielded traditionally masculine power as a military commander and political ruler, the degradation needed to be complete and visible. The triumph served multiple functions. For the soldiers who had fought, it was validation of their sacrifice and a share in the glory. For the Senate, it was proof of the generals, and by extension, Rome's continued dominance. For the common people, it was entertainment, yes, but also instruction. Every captured queen paraded through the streets was a living lesson. This is what happens when you resist. This is what happens when you rise above your station. This is what happens when you forget your place. The sexual dimension was unavoidable and intentional. Captured queens were displayed in ways that emphasized their physical vulnerability. their femininity weaponized against them. The exposure, the chains, the deliberate destruction of their royal bearing, all of it served to reduce them from political threats to sexual objects, from sovereigns to slaves. And after the parade, history records 3 typical fates. Some were executed immediately after the triumph. The traditional method was strangulation in the Tullianum, a private death after a public degradation. The executioner would wait until the triumphal procession reached the temple of Jupiter, then descend to the dungeon below and end it with a cord around the throat. Quick, efficient, and final. Others were kept alive as permanent exhibits of Roman victory, paraded out for subsequent triumphs, or kept in wealthy Roman households as living curiosities. They would spend decades as showpieces, their royal identity reduced to a party trick, a conversation starter for dinner guests. The third option was arguably worst: release into internal exile within Italy, where they lived under constant surveillance, stripped of power, family, and identity. They were ghosts, haunting the periphery of the empire that had destroyed them, neither free nor fully enslaved. As Zenobia climbed the Capitoline Hill, the final destination of every triumph, her legs finally gave out. The accounts say she collapsed 3 times, and each time, the crowd's reaction mixed cheers with something more complicated. By the time she reached the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, where Aurelian would offer sacrifice and thanksgiving, her feet were shredded, her face was swollen from heat and exhaustion, and the golden chains had rubbed her wrists and ankles raw. She was made to kneel before the statue of Jupiter, before the assembled Senate, before Aurelian himself. In that moment, the woman who had ruled the East, who had defied Rome for 5 years, who had declared herself Augusta and minted coins in her own name, that woman ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. But here the story takes an unexpected turn, one that reveals how even in victory, Rome's cruelty was unpredictable. Aurelian did not execute her. Instead, according to the Historia Augusta, he granted her a villa in Tibur, modern Tivoli, and a pension. She lived there under guard but comfortable for the remainder of her life. Some sources even claim she married a Roman senator, that she became a fixture of Roman society, hosting gatherings where she would tell stories of her campaigns, her resistance reduced to dinner theater. Was this mercy? Or was it the cruelest punishment of all, to be kept alive as a trophy, to watch her sons grow up as Romans, to see her empire's memory fade while she remained, a living relic of her own defeat? The Romans understood something profound about power. It's not enough to win. The victory must be remembered, recorded, and ritualized. The triumph served this purpose perfectly. It transformed military conquest into religious ceremony, political propaganda into public entertainment, and human beings into symbols. But symbols can be dangerous. Every captured queen paraded through Rome's streets was meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Yet each one also preserved the memory of that resistance. Zenobia's chains told Rome's citizens that she had been dangerous enough to require them. Boudica's suicide declared that even in defeat, she retained the power to deny Rome its final triumph. Arsinoe's youth and beauty elicited forbidden sympathy that threatened Caesar's propaganda machine. The very act of public degradation created martyrs, even if Rome never intended it. Centuries later, these women would be remembered not for their submission, but for the fact that Rome considered them threatening enough to require such elaborate rituals of domination. What makes Rome's treatment of captured queens particularly disturbing is its systematic nature. This wasn't random brutality or the excesses of individual commanders. It was institutionalized, codified, expected. The triumph had rules, protocols, traditions stretching back centuries. There were officials whose entire job was to prepare prisoners for display. There were craftsmen who specialized in creating the chains, tailors who altered the regalia, painters who applied the cosmetics. Think about that. Rome had bureaucratized the degradation of royal captives. There were forms to fill out, budgets to approve, scheduling conflicts to resolve. The torture was industrial, mechanical, cold. This reveals something crucial about how empires function. Cruelty at scale requires organization. It needs logistics, supply chains, trained personnel. The casual brutality of a soldier in the field is one thing, terrible but comprehensible as a failure of individual morality. But when that brutality becomes a civic institution, when the degradation of human beings is transformed into public ceremony complete with ticket sales and preferred seating, we're looking at something different. Evil as administrative function, suffering as state policy. Why does this history make us sick? Not just disturbed or saddened, but physically nauseated in a way that transcends intellectual disapproval? Perhaps because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The crowd that jeered Zenobia wasn't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people. Shopkeepers, laborers, merchants, families with children. They brought their sons and daughters to watch a woman bleed and stumble through the streets, and they cheered. This was their entertainment, their holiday, their celebration. The Romans who designed and executed these triumphs were sophisticated, cultured, often brilliant. They wrote philosophy, poetry, legal treatises that still influence modern thought. Yet they also created an industrial system for the public torture of conquered royalty. These things coexisted, apparently without contradiction, and that's what haunts us. Not that ancient Romans were monsters, but that they were human. That civilization and cruelty are not opposites, but can be intimately intertwined. That the same society that gave us aqueducts and representative government also gave us the triumph, the gladiatorial games, the calculated degradation of the powerless as public spectacle. The Via Sacra still exists in Rome. You can walk it today, your feet following the same path that Zenobia's bloodied soles traced 17 centuries ago. The marble is worn smooth now, polished by millions of tourist shoes. But if you know the history, every step feels different. There's no monument to the queens who were broken here. No plaque marks the spots where they collapsed. The triumph has been sanitized, reduced to a few paragraphs in history textbooks about Roman military tradition. We remember the conquerors, Caesar, Pompey, Trajan, Aurelian, but the names of their victims have largely faded. Yet they remain, somehow, in the stones themselves. In the architecture of the Tullianum, now a church but still accessible, still descending into that rock-cut pit. In the scattered sources that describe, sometimes obliquely, what happened during those hours of orchestrated humiliation. In the dreams and nightmares of everyone who has since studied this history and felt that peculiar sick feeling, the recognition that humans are capable of this, that we have been capable of this, that somewhere in our collective DNA is both the victim and the architect of such systematic cruelty. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Rome's treatment of captured queens isn't what happened during the triumph itself. It's what happened after, in the quiet erasure of their stories, the way history conspired to make them footnotes to their captors' glory. We know the names of the Roman generals who defeated these women. We know their tactics, their political careers, their family trees. But of the queens themselves, their voices are almost entirely lost. We read about them through the accounts of Roman historians who viewed them as enemies, curiosities, or cautionary tales. Their own words, their own perspectives, their version of events, gone, destroyed, deliberately forgotten. This, too, was part of Rome's machinery of domination, not just to defeat enemies, but to erase them from narrative, to ensure that history would remember only the triumph and not the humanity of those broken beneath it. But incomplete erasure can be its own kind of evidence. The gaps in the historical record, the euphemisms, the coded language about outrages and dishonor, they testify to things so terrible that even ancient historians accustomed to describing carnage in detail chose silence instead. That silence is its own kind of scream. Conclusion. The taste of ashes. Night falls over the Via Sacra. The tourists have gone home. The modern city hums with life. Restaurants, cars, light pollution obscuring the stars that Zenobia saw on her last night of dignity. 1,700 years separate us from that August day when a desert queen shuffled in golden chains through Rome's heart. We tell ourselves we're different now, that we've evolved beyond such calculated cruelty, that the triumph belongs to a more barbaric age. But the stones remember what we'd rather forget, that the crowds who cheered were human, that the officials who organized the spectacle were human, that the entire apparatus of systematic degradation was designed and executed by people not fundamentally different from us. The triumph wasn't an aberration. It was tradition, celebrated, refined over centuries, participated in by the best and brightest of Roman civilization. And if they were capable of transforming human suffering into civic ceremony, into entertainment, into a tool of political control, what does that say about the civilizations we've built since? What spectacles of suffering have we normalized, sanitized, turned into policy? These are the questions Zenobia's chains still ask. If you're willing to walk that ancient road and listen, the marble beneath your feet is worn smooth. But if you know where to look, you can still see the stains that never quite washed away. History isn't past. It's a continuous present, always asking us to examine not just what they did then, but what we're doing now, what we're capable of, what we've chosen to forget. The triumph ended centuries ago. But the machinery it represented, the reduction of human beings to symbols, the choreographed degradation of the defeated, the transformation of cruelty into ceremony, that never truly stopped. It just learned to disguise itself in the language of progress, necessity, civilization. And that should make you sick. Because if it doesn't, if you can read this history and feel nothing, then perhaps the crowd that jeered on the Via Sacra isn't as distant as we'd like to believe. The chains are still there, in the museum. 40 pounds of golden iron commissioned for one woman's humiliation. They're kept behind glass now, labeled and documented. But late at night, when the museum is empty, if you listen carefully, they still rattle.